What if the energy weapon the United States believed it controlled suddenly stopped working? What if the country Washington thought it could pressure the most quietly removed the biggest pressure point in the entire relationship? And what if, while political tensions and tariff threats dominated the headlines, Canada was making a series of energy deals thousands of miles away that completely changed the equation? Because something unusual is happening in the global energy market, and most people are only starting to notice it now. For decades, the United States held enormous leverage in its economic relationship with Canada. The logic seemed obvious. Canada exported the majority of its energy south. Oil pipelines ran directly into American refineries. Natural gas flowed across the border in massive volumes every single day. Geography tied the two economies together in ways that appeared almost permanent. In Washington, this created a powerful assumption. Canada needed access to the American market more than America needed Canadian exports. That assumption quietly shaped negotiations for years. When trade disputes appeared, the belief was that Canada would eventually compromise because its energy economy depended so heavily on U.S. buyers. But the world energy map has been shifting, and Canada appears to have noticed earlier than most. While political debates were happening in Washington and trade tensions were escalating, Canadian policymakers were focusing on something far less visible but far more strategic: energy diversification. Instead of relying almost entirely on pipelines running south, Canada began investing in a completely different route, a route that would bypass American territory entirely: the Pacific. Along the coast of British Columbia, massive liquefied natural gas projects began to take shape. Facilities designed not to send gas into the United States, but across the Pacific Ocean toward Asia. At first, these projects attracted little global attention. Energy infrastructure often takes years to build, and many observers assumed they were simply long-term economic investments. But timing matters in geopolitics. Because just as Canada's LNG infrastructure was accelerating, global energy demand began shifting dramatically. Asia's appetite for natural gas was growing at an extraordinary pace. Japan needed stable supplies to replace nuclear power generation. South Korea was expanding its LNG imports. India's industrial demand was rising quickly. Southeast Asian economies were entering new stages of energy consumption, and all of them were searching for one thing above everything else: reliability. Recent geopolitical shocks had made energy security more important than ever. Conflicts, sanctions, and supply disruptions had shown governments how dangerous it was to depend on unstable regions. That is where Canada suddenly looked extremely attractive: a politically stable democracy, predictable regulations, strong environmental standards, no risk of sudden sanctions or political blackmail. For Asian buyers looking for long-term energy contracts, that combination was incredibly valuable. Slowly but steadily, long-term LNG supply agreements began appearing between Canadian producers and Asian customers. These were not short-term deals. Many of them stretched 15, 20, even 25 years into the future. And that is when analysts began noticing something important. Every contract signed across the Pacific reduced Canada's dependence on the United States. This is where the strategic implications start to become clear. Donald Trump's economic strategy has often relied on leverage. Tariffs, trade pressure, and market access restrictions have been used as tools to force negotiations. The strategy works best when the other side depends heavily on American markets. But leverage only works when alternatives do not exist. Canada is quietly building alternatives. Natural gas that once had only one major export direction is now gaining another. Instead of flowing exclusively south through pipelines, Canadian gas can now be liquefied, loaded onto tankers, and shipped west across the Pacific Ocean. Ships do not care about borders. They follow contracts, and contracts are exactly what Canada has been securing. The effect of this shift may be difficult to see at first, but its long-term consequences could be enormous. For decades, geography gave the United States a natural advantage. Canada sits directly above the American economy, and energy infrastructure naturally developed along that north-south axis. But LNG changes the rules. Liquefied and natural gas terminals allow energy to travel anywhere in the world. Once gas becomes LNG, it is no longer tied to pipelines or borders. It becomes global. And once energy exports become global, political leverage begins to shrink. This is the moment where many experts believe Washington may have underestimated Canada's strategy. While trade disputes and tariff threats dominated public discussions, Canada focused on something quieter but far more permanent: building the infrastructure that would give it options. And in international trade, options equal power. The more markets a country can access, the harder it becomes to pressure that country economically. Asian LNG demand created a perfect opportunity for Canada to expand those options. Japan and South Korea were eager for long-term contracts. India was searching for additional supply to power industrial growth. Several Southeast Asian nations were rapidly increasing LNG imports as they moved away from coal. Canadian exporters stepped into that demand at exactly the right moment. New shipping routes were planned across the Pacific. Long-term purchase agreements locked in demand. Energy companies invested billions into facilities capable of freezing natural gas into liquid form and loading it onto specialized carriers. Slowly, a new energy corridor began forming, not south toward the United States, but west toward Asia. And that corridor may be altering the balance of power more than anyone expected. Imagine a future trade dispute between Washington and Ottawa. In the past, American policymakers could assume that Canadian energy exports had limited alternatives. That assumption provided quiet negotiating power. Now that assumption is weaker. If Asian markets are purchasing increasing volumes of Canadian LNG, Ottawa gains breathing room. Pressure becomes less effective. Negotiations become more balanced. This does not mean the alliance between the two countries disappears. The United States and Canada remain deeply connected economically and politically. But dependence and partnership are not the same thing. Dependence creates leverage. Partnership creates negotiation. By diversifying energy exports, Canada may be shifting the relationship from the first category toward the second. Another factor makes this shift even more significant. Energy flows shape global alliances. Countries that rely on each other for long-term energy supplies tend to build deeper diplomatic and economic ties. If Asian economies become major buyers of Canadian LNG, Canada's strategic engagement with the Indo-Pacific region naturally increases. Trade missions expand. Infrastructure investments grow. Political cooperation deepens. Energy deals rarely remain just energy deals. They become the foundation for broader relationships. And this is why Canada's LNG agreements with Asia could carry geopolitical consequences far beyond the energy market itself. Some analysts believe this may represent one of the most important quiet shifts in North American trade dynamics in decades. Instead of being locked almost entirely into the U.S. energy market, Canada is gradually turning into a global supplier. That transition takes time. LNG infrastructure is expensive and complex, but once those facilities begin operating at full capacity, the change becomes extremely difficult to reverse. Energy supply chains tend to last for generations. A pipeline or terminal built today may shape trade patterns for 30 years or more. That is why governments treat these projects as strategic assets. And Canada appears to be building exactly that. For Washington, the challenge is not that Canada is becoming hostile. The two countries remain allies and close partners. The challenge is that Canada is becoming more independent. Independent countries cannot be pressured as easily. They negotiate differently. They respond differently to economic threats. And they make decisions based on a wider range of options. From Canada's perspective, diversification simply reduces vulnerability. Relying on a single dominant buyer always carries risks. Expanding into multiple markets spreads those risks and stabilizes long-term revenue. But from a geopolitical perspective, the impact is much larger. The more energy Canada sends across the Pacific, the less any single partner can control the terms of trade. And that may be the most important consequence of all. If Canada's LNG industry continues expanding and Asian demand keeps growing, the balance of leverage in North American trade negotiations could quietly shift. Not through confrontation, not through dramatic political announcements, but through infrastructure, contracts, and global shipping routes. In the world of geopolitics, those slow structural changes often matter more than headline-grabbing speeches, because once an energy corridor is built and markets are connected, the strategic landscape rarely goes back to the way it was before. And that may be exactly what Canada understood when it began pushing LNG projects toward the Pacific coast. While the world focused on tariffs and political arguments, a new energy route was quietly taking shape. A route that could carry Canadian gas thousands of miles away from North America. A route that gives Canada something every country values in global trade: choice. And once a country gains choice, the rules of the negotiation table begin to change. The question now is how far this transformation will go. Will Canada's Pacific LNG corridor become one of the world's major energy supply routes? Could Asian demand turn Canada into a central player in the Indo-Pacific energy market? And if that happens, how will it reshape the balance of economic influence between Washington and Ottawa? Because one thing is becoming increasingly clear: energy leverage only works when there are no alternatives. And Canada may have just created one.